A white gull wheeled once and vanished into the fog, as if swallowed whole. Inside the yellow house above the harbor, a dinner bell rang like a prayer that knew better. Remember why this matters. When power feeds itself, it names the hunger a virtue and locks the kitchen from the inside. Port Grace, Newfoundland. Sound, smell, texture, the bell's thin tin note, the stink of cod oil riding damp air, the grain of salt rough, boards beneath work-worn palms. On the hill, shutters blinked against a southerly squall, and below, at 7:15 in the evening on October 3rd, 1846, the family with the high gables and the higher appetites took their places at a long pine table. A brass key turned twice in a pantry door. A pot lid clicked. Steam ghosted the rafters. The camera of memory settles behind one figure only. A young woman known on the dock ledgers as Anika, property household, known in the quarters behind the cooper's shed as Ani, the one who remembers. Her hands moved with that practiced invisibility. Enslaved cooks learned early lift, pour, stir, clear, yet her gaze kept snagging on small, treacherous facts. The quiet spoon in the patriarch's right hand. The way the eldest son licked a thumb before turning a prayer book page. The mother's smile, sweet as lie. Outside, the fishing rooms thudded with boots. Inside, a broth breathed on the boil. Hunger changes its face. At the strike of 7:20, the harbor clock coughed out a single late chime. Ani counted it the way one counts breaths during a storm, because storms in Port Grace did not always arrive from the sea. Some arrived on two legs and left prints that needed sanding out of the floorboards by dawn. She ladled careful portions, head bent to the steam so no one could read her eyes. Salt cod, onions, boiled biscuit, the old ingredients rearranged. On the mantel, a small wooden carving, two wolves sharing one tongue watched without blinking. A pattern interrupt, tucked like a blade inside the linen. Two lines inked in a ledger earlier that day, copied in Ani's neat hand while the master was down at the shipping office. Bills of sale, 5 souls, 1 for kitchen, 2 for field, 2 for sea. The date above it, July 8th, 1843, had a gray smear where an oily thumb had rested too long. Ani had traced that smear, learning the shape. Some people signed names. Some left stains. On evenings like this, the house smelled not just of supper, but of secrets preserved in brine. The family talked of prices and barrels, of how many quintals the flakes had dried, of whether winter would bite or merely gnaw. No one said the other word, the one certain sailors used in whispers when a ship came home too light on men and too heavy with caution. The word in tongues along these coasts wore coats, survival, medicine, courage. In the yellow house, it wore Sunday clothes and kept the pantry key on a ring. Do you ever wonder when a custom becomes a crime? Across the lane, a neighbor shut her shutters at the first whiff of rain and the second of trouble. She had heard things, the hitch in a cry, the drag of a crate across a floor after midnight, the way the family's dogs didn't bark on certain Thursdays. She had watched Ani once, cradling a bundle to her chest behind the smokehouse, the bundle too still to be laundry. She had closed her shutters then too, and whispered a prayer she didn't intend to answer. What would you do, standing at your window while the bell rings and the fog thickens? Ani learned this. Silence has a texture. It lives in the nap of the tablecloth, in the waxy feel of candle stubs pinched out before they finish their work, in the slick of rendered fat that clings to a ladle even after scrubbing. Tonight, she could feel that silence under her nails. The master's niece, a girl with a ribbon the color of old bruises, pushed her bowl toward Ani without looking up. More, the girl said, not a request. Ani filled it to the brim, watching the ripple settle, like breath returning to a sleeping body. There were rules in this house, written nowhere and carved everywhere. Rule 1, nothing leaves the pantry without the key. Rule 2. Nothing enters the ground by accident. Rule 3. When strangers come up the path, the children are sent to the loft with a story about wolves in the trees. The wolves never came, because the wolves were already seated at the table. At 7:30, a boy in the scullery, the last of the indentured from Cork, a figure the accounts called least, as if that made him freer, wiped his hands on his shirt and nodded toward Annie in the way of someone who knew a sign when he saw one. He had watched her measure the herbs with that extra beat of hesitation that means more than caution. He had seen her pull a small paper from her sleeve and slip it into the stove. He had smelled something not from a garden. He returned to his sink, to the tap of tin on tin, and said nothing. The sea teaches you to keep your mouth closed. On the mantel, the wolves kept watching. Primary source fragment, filed later in a clerk's box with damp edges. File note, October 4th, 1846. A complaint, unsigned, regarding curious preservations at the house of M. of Harbor Hill. No signatures, no action. Down in the fish rooms, knives kept their brutal honesty, singing along cod spines, slicing clean through the day. Up here, every blade was polite. The patriarch lifted his spoon, tasted, nodded once. He liked a broth that remembered what it had been before boiling. He liked the way people forgot themselves after a second bowl. He liked the pantry key, heavy in his pocket. Annie liked the map she had made in her mind. Pantry to stove, stove to stair, stair to back door to downhill path, past the cooper's yard. The cooper, who owed her a favor because she had taught his son to lace his boots with one hand after the other, was crushed under a cask. A pattern interrupt, an anecdote, quiet as a match. The last winter, 2 men had gone missing after a gale, and when the thaw came, a sack washed up near Black Kettle Cove. They said the sack held nothing but bones, and the bones said nothing back. The yellow house on the hill sent down a pot of stew to the searchers who combed the beach. They ate, grateful, and did not ask for the recipe. Are you starting to taste the echo? In the quarters, 6 souls shared a room meant for 2. A rosary hung beside a rope for drying socks. Somebody's song about summer came out in winter syllables. Annie had learned the timetables of Port Grace, when the church bell could be heard at the far traps, when the constable went to cards, when the tide pulled hard enough to cover footprints on the strand within the hour. She had learned the timetables of the family too, the lull between second helpings and third, the precise minute when the eldest son's jaw softened and the mother's hand sought the key ring by instinct alone. The bell rang again, not as loud this time. The fog pressed against the glass. The brass key winked in candlelight, like a seal on a treaty no one had read. Annie placed the final bowl, stepped back, wiped her hands, and let the room blur to a watercolor of pale faces and dark wood. Somewhere outside, a door opened and shut with care. Somewhere beyond that, men told stories about ice that bit ankles, about seals that looked like people when the moon was wrong. In Port Grace, stories didn't stray far. They waited in porches and climbed the hill when called. All at once, the wind shifted. It brought with it a new trio: sound, smell, texture, the slap of wet rope against a bollard, the faint iron tang that doesn't come from cod. The drag of wool on timber as a weight is hauled from one darkness to another. Annie didn't turn. She didn't need to. The pantry door opened. The key scraped. Familiar as breath. Hunger sits at the head. Kidneys, the mother said lightly, the way polite people say weather. For iron. The niece clapped her hands once and reached for the platter's lid. Annie's fingers tightened around the towel until threads sang apart. The boy in the scullery looked at the floor and saw nothing but his own shoes. Across the lane, the neighbor pinched her candle out and pretended the night was ordinary. Silence found its shape. The clock on the harbor struck 7:47. Ani leaned toward the flame, just enough to cast her face into shadow, and said in a voice she had practiced to sound like soft obedience, "Shall I fetch the small jar from the shelf?" "Ma'am, the one marked for winter?" The mother smiled. The key turned again. Ani's eyes followed it into the dark. "We have not yet spoken the word, but the house has." Cliffhanger. When the pantry door swung wide, Ani stepped forward with the towel, and the boy in the scullery caught, at the edge of lamplight, a tag on a hook, rough cloth, stitched with letters that were not a name but a date. He looked up, and the mother saw him seeing. The pantry smelled of cloves and cod oil, a mingling that clung to the beams as if history itself had soaked into the wood. The clink of the brass key echoed too loudly in the cramped space, and for the first time in years, Ani felt every hair along her arms rise. Remember why this matters. The key was more than a tool. It was a sentence of life or death, and tonight, it might finally write itself backwards. Inside the pantry, shelves bowed under jars, sealed with wax, salted cuts, wrapped in cloth, and bottles that carried no labels. Each had a place. Each place had a meaning. Ani's gaze moved to one jar on the top shelf, its wax darker than the rest, its contents shifting when the air stirred. The mother's hand hovered there, then paused, and in that pause, a memory intruded last winter's storm, when neighbors whispered about meat stew, served days after a young deckhand disappeared. The whispers never reached a constable's ear. The pantry door had closed too quickly. Tonight, it stood open. The boy in the scullery stayed frozen outside the threshold, staring at the cloth tag dangling from a hook. The date stitched there was not a birth nor a christening, but a disappearance. August 19th, 1844. Ani's pulse beat in her throat as she saw his lips form the numbers, though no sound came. She shook her head once, subtle, enough to send him back to his bucket. He obeyed, water sloshing loud as confession. 3 sensory cues hit at once. The sour tang of vinegar rising as a jar was lifted, the dull scrape of wood on wood as the shelf gave slightly, the clammy texture of salt crystals clinging to Ani's palms as she steadied the tray. A voice broke the rhythm, the patriarch's son, grumbling about markets and street johns. The sound of normalcy, stretched thin as paper. What would you do if you were that boy, reading a date on a cloth tag, knowing its truth, but standing between hunger and the sea? Ani had learned to read faces like tides. Tonight, she read the mother's careful mask, the patriarch's impatience, the children's unknowing. She also read the silence of the enslaved quarters, where ears bent forward but no footsteps approached. Everyone had chosen not to see. Everyone had chosen survival, in their own way. Pattern interrupt a statistic buried in shipping ledgers. Between 1830 and 1850, nearly 1/5 of recorded lost-at-sea cases in outports like Port Grace carried notes of unrecovered remains. Bodies vanish in water. Records vanish in ink. Hunger leaves no trail, but the satisfaction of silence. By 7:52, Ani carried the tray back into the dining room. A lid covered the dish, steam pressing at the seam. Candlelight flickered across pewter plates, and the wolves on the mantel gleamed as if their teeth were wet. She set the platter down, stepped back, and let the patriarch lift the lid himself. The room filled with a smell not wholly from herbs. It was richer, metallic, and for a moment, every conversation faltered. The patriarch inhaled deeply, smiled, and said one word that tasted like iron and command. "Serve." Ani's hand trembled once, just once, before she steadied it with the towel. The boy in the scullery dropped a spoon, the clatter too sharp, and every head turned. His face went pale, but the moment passed as quickly as it had come. He bent, picked it up, and washed it again. The harbor clock rang 8 o'clock. fog pressed harder against the shutters, blurring the lanterns outside to halos. Ani caught the boy's eye just once across the room, her look carrying all the weight of what he'd seen in the pantry. His lips stayed sealed. Cliffhanger. As the first portions were ladled out, a thin crack appeared in the plaster above the hearth, spreading like a line drawn by unseen hands. And in the silence that followed, a sound carried through the fog from the harbor, a long, low moan, half wind, half something else, drifting toward the yellow house. The sound that seeped through the fog was not a gull's cry and not the wind's whistle. It was deeper, heavier, like the hull of a ship grinding against unseen rock. Every ear at the table turned toward it, though no one spoke. Remember why this matters. The moan was not weather, but memory of what had been carried from sea to shore and what never left the family's table. The patriarch raised his glass to cut the silence, muttering about storms rolling early this season. But Ani saw how his fingers twitched against the stem, betraying recognition. The boy in the scullery paused in his scrubbing, his rag dripping, his eyes searching the fog beyond the window. The mother's niece chewed slowly, head cocked, as if listening for a song she half remembered. Sound, smell, texture, the drip of rain beginning against slate shingles, the reek of burning tallow, thickening the air, the rough nap of the wool runner snagging beneath Ani's heel as she stepped back. Every sense reported warning. By 8:10, the family was eating, the silence broken only by spoons scraping bowls. The broth's flavor carried a weight none of the children understood, but their elders did. The patriarch's wife glanced at the pantry door, still ajar, and shut it with a single sharp gesture. The brass key clinked back to her pocket. In the quarters, the enslaved workers stilled their hands, listening. They had heard the moan too. They knew the sound of foghorns, knew the creak of ice, but this was neither. It was the kind of sound that made men cross themselves without knowing why. What would you have done if you heard that moan and suspected it carried more than air through your window? Pattern interrupt a clerk's note from Street John's shipping registry, December 1844. Brigantine Morning Star. Return from the banks short, 2 deckhands. Captain reports storm. No remains recovered. That note ended with a flourish too neat for truth. The family did not pray before this meal. They talked instead of trade barrels of salted cod bound for Lisbon, debts to be settled with merchants in Halifax, talk of tariffs and shipping routes. They spoke the language of power, not of grace. Ani's silence grew louder with each ladle she poured. She remembered, as she poured, the ledger she had seen once, its ink smudged, recording not just cargo, but names. 5 sold, 3 retained, 2 vanished. Vanished was a word that lived longer than drowned. At 8:22, a knife slipped from the eldest son's hand. It clattered against his plate, the edge ringing against pewter. He laughed it off, but Ani's gaze fixed on the blade, glinting in candlelight. Tools tell truths. Tools remember. The boy in the scullery had not moved. He stood with his rag in one hand, the other clenched around the spoon he'd dropped earlier. His knuckles were white, but his jaw was set. He had read the tag, and now he had heard the moan. The choice was already forming in him, silence or voice. Outside, the moan came again, closer. This time, the dogs in the yard howled, a long, keening note that ended in whimpers. The mother froze mid-bite. One child asked softly, "Is someone calling?" The patriarch slammed his palm on the table. "It is wind, nothing more." But Ani knew the truth. The wind did not stitch dates onto cloth tags. The wind did not echo through locked pantries. The wind did not follow families like a ledger entry left unpaid. Cliffhanger. At 8:25, the boy in the scullery made his choice. He dropped the spoon again, louder this time, and in a trembling voice that shook the broth in every bowl, he whispered, "That sound, it is not the sea." The spoon rolled in a slow circle across the pine boards, each clink louder than the last. For a moment, the only sound in the yellow house was that lonely metal spin. Remember why this matters. A single voice breaking silence can unravel years of fear or end them in a heartbeat. The boy's words, that sound, it is not the sea, hung in the air like smoke refusing to clear. The patriarch's face darkened, veins at his temple swelling as he slammed a fist against the table hard enough to rattle pewter cups. "Enough," he barked, voice hoarse from more than wine. "Wind, nothing more. Eat." But Ani noticed the mother's hand trembling, the brass key tapping against the side of her skirt like a nervous pulse. Sound, smell, texture, the muffled hiss of rain sliding into the hearth's embers, the sour-sweet tang of onions congealing in broth, the sticky feel of sweat forming under Ani's apron. Every sense marked the shift. At 8:30, the boy stood straighter than he had since arriving from Cork 2 winters earlier. His voice wavered, but he pressed on. "There are names on cloth, ma'am. Dates stitched like prayers. I saw them." His eyes flicked toward Ani, seeking confirmation, and for the first time, Ani did not lower her gaze. She held his stare, just long enough to make his words truth. A pattern interrupt a single line from an old parish diary. November 12, 1843. Widow Carroll spoke of voices on the headland, calling in fog. Priest dismissed it as gulls. That entry had no further comment. The patriarch rose halfway from his chair, towering. "Child," he spat, "your tongue will land you back in the fish rooms, or worse. Speak no more." His shadow flared on the wall, the wolves on the mantel grinning behind him. But the boy did not shrink. He whispered louder. "It was not wind, and you know it. What would you do, standing at that table, when silence had kept you alive, but truth might set you free or destroy you?" Ani's heart thudded like a hammer in her chest. She could feel the path she had memorized, the back stair, the cooper's yard, the tide waiting to erase prints, but she stayed. Something in the boy's defiance kindled the ember she had banked for years. The other enslaved workers in the quarters had stilled, ears straining for the storm inside the house. The neighbor across the lane lit her candle again, then blew it out once more, unwilling to watch. The mother leaned forward then, her voice sharp but trembling. "Bring me the jar," she commanded Ani, her eyes flicking toward the pantry. "Now, let them see." Ani froze. She had waited for this order, rehearsed it in her mind with every turn of the brass key. Her hands felt steady, even as her pulse raced. She turned toward the pantry, knowing what lay behind that door would speak louder than any boy's trembling voice. At 8:37, the harbor moan rose once more, closer, louder, rattling shutters and setting dogs to whining. The patriarch barked over it. "Jar, woman, obey." Ani reached for the towel, fingers brushing the handle of the pantry door. The boy's eyes followed her, wide, waiting. Every soul in the house leaned toward that door without moving a muscle. Cliffhanger. As Ani pulled the door wide, the jar she lifted into the lamplight was not the one the mother had meant. The wax seal cracked faintly, and a scrap of cloth inside pressed against the glass, stitched not with a date, but with a name. The lamplight struck the glass and revealed more than food. Inside the jar floated a folded scrap of cloth, pale against the brine, stitched in thread that had not faded. The letters formed a name, jagged but legible. Jonas. Remember why this matters. Names carry weight heavier than dates. They are anchors that refuse to sink, even when the sea demands it. The room froze. The patriarch's jaw tightened. The mother's lips parted, as if to hush, then sealed again. One child asked, in a voice too young to understand, "Who is Jonas?" Ani said nothing. She did not need to. The boy in the scullery, eyes wide, whispered it for her. Jonas was the deckhand. He went missing last winter. Sound, smell, texture. the groan of the hearth's log splitting down the middle, the acrid scent of lamp oil burning too hot, the grainy slick of brine dripping onto Ani's wrist from the jar. Every detail insisted that silence could no longer hold. At 8:45, the patriarch lunged forward, snatching the jar from Ani's hands. Brine sloshed across his cuffs as he slammed it down on the table. "Lies," he barked, voice ragged. "Tricks." But even as he spoke, the cloth inside turned with the liquid, showing the stitchwork clearer. Letters undeniable. The children craned their necks. The eldest son muttered, "I thought he drowned." Pattern interrupted a passage from a sailor's letter to his brother, dated February 2nd, 1845. They said Jonas never returned from the storm, but I saw him carried toward the yellow house. I said nothing, for my own belly growled. Ani's eyes swept the table. She saw hunger wearing its Sunday mask, saw fear coiled behind the mother's stiff posture, saw doubt eating through the son's bravado. She also saw the boy in the scullery straighten. His trembling eased now that proof gleamed under lamplight. What would you have done if you had been that boy speak again, or wait for someone braver? The patriarch growled low, voice scraping like rope through a pulley. "We keep what must be kept. We endure what others cannot. That is our strength." His words were meant as a shield, but Ani recognized them as confession. The brass key tapped once against the table as the mother reached for it, her fingers slick from spilled broth. At 8:50, the fog outside pressed so thick that even the harbor lanterns vanished. The moan returned, longer, deeper, vibrating the glass panes until one cracked with a sharp, splintering cry. The children screamed. The mother gasped. The patriarch shoved the jar aside, brine spilling onto the table runner, the name Jonas drifting in liquid toward the edge. Ani felt the moment like a tide turning. Every secret preserved in that pantry could not be hidden forever. The boy in the scullery lifted his chin and met her gaze again. Silent, but steady. He was not alone now. Cliffhanger. The jar toppled, brine soaking into the wood, and the cloth with Jonas's name slid free, collapsing onto the table like a body laid out for burial. And just then, a knock thundered at the door, 3 hard blows that shook the house. The 3 blows echoed through the house, dull and heavy, as if a hammer struck the very bones of the yellow dwelling. Every spoon stilled midair, every child's breath caught, every eye turned toward the door. Remember why this matters. A knock at the wrong hour can topple an empire built on silence. The patriarch rose slowly, his chair legs scraping harsh across the floorboards. The sound rang out like iron dragged over stone. "Stay seated," he ordered, his voice sharp enough to cut, though his hand trembled where it clutched the table's edge. Ani noted how the brass key swung from the mother's fingers, clinking nervously against her ring. Sound, smell, texture, the hollow reverberation of the knock still lingering in the rafters, the smell of damp wool drifting in through the cracks, the rough grit of saltwater spray rattling against the window glass. The storm was close now. At 8:55, the knock came again, 2 sharp raps this time, as if insisting. The patriarch strode toward the door, but Ani saw hesitation in his gait, a stiffness that betrayed more than age. He paused at the threshold, hand hovering over the latch. The room held its breath. Pattern interrupt an anecdote buried in a constable's winter ledger. March 1845. Visited Harbor Hill House. Report of strange visitors at night. No one opened the door. Found tracks in snow leading both to and away. No charges. The eldest son muttered, "It's the sea hands again. They know." His voice cracked, unconvincing even to himself. The mother shot him, a glare, sharp enough to wound. Ani, standing by the hearth, watched the boy in the scullery shrink back, rag twisting between his fists. Yet his eyes never left the door. What would you have done, seated at that table, if each knock promised either salvation or ruin? The patriarch unlatched the door at last. It creaked open to the fog, thick as wool, curling inside like a living thing. For a moment, nothing was there but shadow. Then a figure appeared bent, cloaked in oilskin, water dripping from the hem. A neighbor? A sailor? Or something else carried up from the harbor moan? The figure spoke, voice muffled but steady. "A storm's coming fast. Better tie down your shutters." Harmless words, yet every face at the table paled. The patriarch grunted, nodded once, and shut the door without invitation. But Ani caught the way the figure's gaze had lingered past him, into the house, as if searching for proof of what the fog already knew. At 9 o'clock, the room had not resumed its rhythm. The broth congealed in bowls. The jar lay shattered on the table runner, Jonas's name spreading dark with brine. The knock had passed, yet the dread it left behind clung tighter than the storm outside. Cliffhanger. As the patriarch returned to his chair, thunder rolled over the harbor, shaking the house to its frame. The brass key slipped from the mother's fingers, landing squarely in Ani's lap. The brass key was warm, slick with the mother's sweat, and heavier than Ani had ever imagined. It thudded against her apron, an ordinary object suddenly glowing with the weight of choice. Remember why this matters. In a house where silence had long been survival, a single key could unlock vengeance or unleash ruin. Ani closed her hand around the key, her pulse drumming against the cold metal. No one seemed to notice at first. The patriarch barked at the children to finish their bowls. The eldest son stared into his wine as if answers floated there. The mother fussed with her shawl, not realizing what she had dropped. Only the boy in the scullery saw. His eyes widened, then narrowed, and he gave the faintest nod. Sound, smell, texture. The roll of thunder pounding the cliffside, the sharp scent of ozone bleeding into the dining room air, the grain of the towel Ani clenched around the key to hide its shine. The storm was no longer at sea, it was here. At 9:10, Ani excused herself. Voice steady, though her knees shook, she slipped toward the pantry door, key hidden in the towel. The patriarch, distracted by the figure at the window, waved her on without thought. The boy's gaze followed her like a lantern in fog. Pattern interrupt an entry from a sailor's log, dated July 21st, 1844. Stopped at Port Grace, paid in cod and silence. They feast well, though the town whispers what none will say. Inside the pantry, Ani slid the key into the lock. The click echoed too loudly, louder than the storm outside. Shelves loomed, lined with jars and cloth-wrapped bundles. She pulled one free, a smaller jar than before, its wax seal still unbroken. Inside, faint shapes pressed against the glass. Not names this time, not dates, something else. Ani's breath caught. She placed it back. What would you do, holding the key to secrets you feared to know? Would you open every jar or smash them all? Back in the dining room, voices rose. The eldest son accused the boy in the scullery of lies. The boy shouted back, desperation, cracking his words. Ani returned quietly, the key still hidden, her eyes sharper now. She had proof enough. She had the weapon the family themselves had forged. At 9:20, the thunder cracked so close it rattled plates. The wolves on the mantel seemed to grin wider in the flicker of lightning. Ani stepped closer to the table, the towel tight in her grip. She caught the mother's eye just for a breath and saw recognition bloom there. The woman's hand darted to her skirt, searching. The key was gone. Cliffhanger. The mother's sharp cry cut across the storm. "The key!" she shouted, voice shrill with terror. Every head turned toward Ani, who stood silent, towel clenched. The storm outside rising like applause. The word key hung in the air like thunder's echo. And for the first time that night, silence broke, not into whispers, but into panic. The children shrieked. The eldest son lunged halfway from his chair. and the patriarch's face went scarlet with fury. Remember why this matters. Control in Port Grace had always hinged on that brass key. Without it, the family's order was nothing but illusion. Ani did not move. She held the towel against her apron as though it carried nothing more than spilled broth. The boy in the scullery straightened, his eyes gleaming with the secret of who truly held power now. The mother's cry sharpened into command, "Give it back," but the storm outside swallowed her voice. Sound, smell, texture, the boom of waves battering the breakwater below the hill, the sharp tang of lightning in the room's still air, the clammy chill of damp cloth tightening in Ani's hands. Each detail pressed the moment taught her. At 9:30, thunder cracked so loud the glass shattered in one window, spraying shards across the floor. A candle toppled, flame licking at the table runner, until Ani snuffed it with her towel. The patriarch roared, "Thief!" and shoved his chair back, the wolves on the mantel looming above him in dancing shadows. But Ani's stillness carried more weight than his rage. Pattern interrupt a line from a constable's report never filed, scrawled and unsigned, dated November 2nd, 1846. Rumors persist. Strange cries at the Hill House. No proof, yet all believe something waits in that pantry. I will not climb that hill again. Ani spoke then, her voice calm, cutting through the chaos. You kept names in jars. You kept secrets in salt. You thought silence would hold. Every syllable landed like stone. The family gaped. The children whimpered. The boy's lips moved silently, repeating her words like a psalm. What would you do, seated in that room, watching a servant speak truths your masters never dared admit? The patriarch lunged toward her, but his foot struck the spilled brine. He slipped, collapsing against the table with a crash that toppled pewter and sent broth across the floor. He wheezed, stunned. The key clinked once in Ani's hand, heavy as judgment. She tucked it beneath her apron, beyond his reach. At 9:38, the harbor moan rose again, louder, closer, as though the sea itself leaned against the walls. The mother's voice cracked in terror. They're coming. They've always come. When she stopped herself too late, the boy gasped. Ani's eyes narrowed. Truth, once spoken, cannot be called back. Cliffhanger. Lightning flared, filling the dining room with white fire. And for a heartbeat, the pantry door stood wide open without a hand upon it. The shelves inside seemed empty, the jars gone, as if the storm had swallowed them whole. And here, legend intrudes whispered in Port Grace even now, that on certain fog-thick nights, a knock still rattles the old yellow house, though no one lives there. Some say the moan you hear in the harbor is not wind, but the names once kept in jars, calling back their stories. The lightning faded, leaving only the dim glow of guttering candles and the echo of the storm. The pantry door swayed open and shut on its hinges, as if some unseen hand toyed with it. Remember why this matters. When secrets spill into the open, no amount of wealth or silence can stitch them closed again. Ani stood rooted, the brass key clutched to her chest. Around her, the family's scrambled children crying, the eldest son barking orders that no one heeded, the mother on her knees, scrabbling at the brine-soaked floor for the jar that was no longer there. The patriarch, face red and eyes blazing, pushed himself upright, but the slip had shaken more than his body. His power, once absolute, now felt as fragile as the glass scattered across the rug. Sound, smell, texture, the crash of waves rising against the cliff wall, the acrid smoke of a candle guttering into wax, the sting of salt spray bursting through the shattered window and speckling every face. The sea had breached their fortress. At 9:45, the boy in the scullery stepped forward. His small voice rose above the storm. She holds the key now. Not you. The declaration cut sharper than any blade. For the first time, the patriarch looked not furious, but afraid. Ani raised her chin, her silence now thunderous. Pattern interrupt an entry from an abolitionist's travel journal, dated May 14th, 1848. In Newfoundland, whispers abound of a house on a hill, a family lost to hunger, a servant vanished into fog. No record exists, yet every fisherman knows the tale. The family broke into argument, voices overlapping, fear spilling faster than the storm. Ani stepped back, her hand closing tight around the key. She could open the pantry, unleash its horrors upon them. Or she could leave, locking it forever, their terror, her revenge. Her choice balanced like the sea itself, calm one moment, raging the next. What would you have done? With the storm beating down the walls and the key hot in your palm, at 9:50, the wolves on the mantel toppled in the quake of thunder. Their carved wooden faces split as they hit the floor. Ani saw it as a sign. She turned without a word, strode to the back stair, and disappeared into the dark. Behind her, the house erupted, screams, shouts, the pounding of fists on doors as the storm claimed more glass, more light, more certainty. By 10 o'clock, the hilltop was silent. The yellow house stood in ruinous, quiet, shutters torn free, door swinging wide. The family was never seen again. No bodies washed ashore, no graves were dug, only the moan of the harbor and the rumors that multiplied like smoke. In the weeks that followed, neighbors whispered of the enslaved who vanished that night, Ani among them. Some claimed they fled on a schooner that slipped into the storm. Others swore they walked straight into the fog and were swallowed whole. The jars were never found. Cliffhanger close. A year later, in the parish registry, a single unsigned note appeared. It read only, "Debt settled in salt. The names are free." We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.